Mr. President, I rise today to talk about our military construction program and some concerns that I have about an apparent shift in strategy, what this means for our American soldiers and their families, and for the growing debt and deficits that we are seeing by the taxpayers in this country. Without question, our military construction program should be fiscally responsible and driven by the future security posture of the U.S. forces. Dating back to the end of the Cold War, the U.S. military determined that our armed forces would be best trained and equipped for service when stationed at installations on U.S. soil. Our military adopted a force projection strategy that allows our U.S.-stationed servicemen and women to deploy from home rather than being based primarily overseas. This Congress has been very supportive of the Army's transformation to a more modular and expeditionary force structure, allowing more troops to be stationed in the United States. And we have done military construction to accommodate those troops coming back. In 2005, the Overseas Basing Commission reaffirmed the force projection strategy. It applauded the vision behind the Pentagon's efforts to transform the military and restation tens of thousands of military personnel back on U.S. soil. Our own Base Closing Commission provided for the building of our military construction in America so that those troops coming back would have the housing and training facilities to accommodate them and their families. So the Pentagon's strategy, endorsed by the Overseas Basing Commission, has guided the way Congress directs resources and funding for military construction facilities. We have invested more than $14 billion to build housing, stationing, training, and deployment capabilities at major military installations in the United States. And we have proven we can best train and deploy from the United States and do it more cost-effectively. Despite these taxpayer-backed investments, the Pentagon's current MILCON program is shifting military construction projects, military forces, and taxpayer dollars overseas. Strategically, this would set in motion a worldwide transformation of U.S. basing that would actually expand our overseas presence. And this at a time when the aid given to American efforts in the war on terror is, with a few exceptions, not impressive. Finally, the Department of Defense is pursuing expensive and, in some cases, duplicative military construction projects in Europe, Korea, and Guam without demonstrating adequate cost efficiencies or projected future costs. This shift in global posture fundamentally disconnects with stateside basing capabilities and reverses the Overseas Basing Commission's recommendations that were passed by Congress. In Europe, in Germany, massive plans are underway to move U.S. Army headquarters from Heidelberg to Wiesbaden. I question this move because European and African commands already have substantial infrastructure in Stuttgart, where efficiencies would be available. And the Government Accounting Office does not believe the Army will achieve any cost savings. Not only would these huge and costly projects create thousands of foreign jobs, but they would require continuous taxpayer funding to maintain facilities and training capabilities. The United States has averaged spending $278 million per year in Germany in the last 5 years. But the Department of Defense now plans to raise that spending to $750 million per year. It costs nearly 15% less to build in the United States than to build in Germany. And while American taxpayers have invested $1.4 billion in German infrastructure from 2006 to 2010, Germany's contribution has averaged $20 million per year, or less than 10%. This is a poor taxpayer investment considering the serious limitations to U.S. military training and deployment capabilities overseas. It would also create duplicative headquarters at several locations in Germany. Our troops must have access to training areas where they can maneuver freely, conduct live fire exercises, and work with night vision devices. Many overseas locations prohibit such intensive training. Others allow only certain aspects of the training to be done under closely monitored circumstances. These limitations hinder the readiness of our troops while taxing our citizens more. Deployment impediments also exist in Europe. During times of peace and war, our troops face restrictions traveling through many countries surrounding Germany. In 2003, deploying American forces from Germany into Iraq was complicated when several European countries denied U.S. troops access to air or ground routes. Merely having our troops forward deployed is no guarantee that they will be available when and where we need them. Korea. The Department of Defense is also planning to spend millions to build deployment facilities in Korea. The Pentagon is proposing to shift one-year deployments for troops alone to three-year tours that include their families. This change would expand U.S. presence in Korea from 30,000 service personnel to approximately 84,000, counting dependents. Substantial taxpayer funding would be required to build adequate housing, schools, hospitals, fitness centers, child care facilities, commissaries, and more. We have asked for the numbers that would be projected for this. The department has not given us any numbers nor any projections on the costs of adding 50,000 more people into Korea than we now have. Investing these resources into Korea makes no sense when we are already building up infrastructure and deployment capabilities at U.S. bases where amenities support military families and are well established. Guam. Plans to shift Marines currently stationed in Japan to the tiny island of Guam are also problematic. There are significant environmental concerns with trying to accommodate such a large number of military personnel in such a small space, and the island lacks sufficient existing infrastructure. In addition to that, the timeline for transitioning Marines stationed in Japan is implausible, and the costs are staggering. They are now estimated at $16 billion. With these considerable barriers, better basing alternatives should be explored. Again, we have asked the department to look into this, to give alternatives. We have suggested alternatives. We have received nothing back. The Department of Defense has indicated that this new military construction program is intended to build partnership capacity. Some argue that U.S. presence overseas provides assurance to our allies and deterrence to our adversaries. History has shown this is not always the case. Basing American military personnel at key locations in Europe did not deter the Russians from conducting military operations against Georgia in 2008. Even with our 30,000 troops in Korea, North Korea did not hesitate to attack a South Korean naval vessel in May of this year. And let's look at what the partnership agreements that we are seeking have given us so far. We are in a war on terror in which the United States now has 78,000 troops. Germany has 4,350. The United Kingdom has double what Germany has. So the United Kingdom, which has a smaller population, has more troops by double than Germany, and yet we are looking at all of this buildup in Germany for building partnership capacity. Germany contributes 4% of NATO troops to Afghanistan, but they have strict rules of engagement that include not going on offense and restrictions on night operations. So if we are going to do so much ourselves, does it make sense for the American taxpayer to be building what would be about $1.5 billion more in Germany in facilities that we already have in the United States? Or if there needs to be more Army building in Germany, at least do it in Stuttgart, where the Army already has a headquarters, instead of a whole new operation in Wiesbaden. If the United States wants to make sure that our allies are assured and deter our enemies, we should do it with strong military capabilities and sound policy, not by keeping troops stationed overseas, siphoning funds from equipment and arms, and putting it into duplicative military construction. Instead of breaking ground on military projects abroad and advancing the department's new goal of building partnership capacity, we should be building American infrastructure. We are carrying the heaviest load by far in the war on terror, and we are carrying it for freedom-loving people throughout the world. We need to build up bases in our country, which we have already done, to accommodate the strategy since the Cold War, and yet now we appear to be reversing that strategy, and I am asking why. I have asked the Department of Defense, I have asked the Secretary of Defense for answers, and have not yet been able to receive anything that would show why we would make such a huge investment in these foreign bases with training constraints and deployment restraints when we can do the same thing at home and deploy our troops at will. Following World War II, the United States constructed bases in Europe to establish a strong presence as nations rebuilt. We stayed in Europe and placed bases in Korea to protect the interests of America and its allies during the Cold War. The world has changed, and with it, our nation's military priorities must also change. Our military construction investment should reflect our strategic principles. It should meet the needs of military families. It should maximize the force flexibility of our modern military, and it should demonstrate the fiscal discipline that taxpayers rightly expect. Secretary Gates has made fiscal discipline a priority at the Department of Defense. He has said we are going to cut defense spending. So this military construction plan is puzzling. I'm not sure that the military and the department heads are on the same wavelength, because we are looking at $1 billion of foreign construction that we do not need, with capacity that we have already built in America. So I am asking the Department of Defense to look at this and to make sure that we are in every way having a respect for the taxpayers and making sure that our military and our families have the security and support they need, and I believe that can be done with bases at home. I will offer amendments to reduce the level of spending in overseas construction and possibly in administrative costs at the Department of Veterans Affairs that do not affect veterans' health care or benefits. There is more at stake for our future, for our economy, and for the American taxpayer. Out-of-control spending is putting the short and long-term fiscal health of the United States at risk. The national public debt is an historic $13 trillion. That was last May. This year, the federal government is borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar it spends, and it is spending 67% more than it brings in. In pursuit of its costly and damaging big government agenda, the Obama administration has increased the total public debt by $2 trillion in less than 2 years, an increase of 23% in 16 months. If the spending continues at this rate, at the end of President Obama's first term, he will have added an additional $6 trillion to the public debt. If we go along with the request of the White House, $6 trillion more will be added to our debt in this term. This is irresponsible and unsustainable. As the appropriations process moves forward, I will offer amendments to bring military construction back down to levels that are consistent with the Secretary of Defense's own stated objective, which is to cut military spending. I am going to offer amendments that I believe will be responsible, will protect our forces, and be better for our military families, and it will achieve the spending cuts that the Secretary has said he believes are necessary. We need to make the tough decisions. I am offering a way forward. I am offering common sense cuts that will assure that we will be able to meet the needs of our military, the security of our military, the security of the American people, and a respect for this enormous deficit. We can cut back on this deficit with responsible spending. Mr. President, I've outlined some of these concerns in today's Politico magazine, and I'd ask that my op-ed be submitted for the record. Thank you, Mr. President. I very much appreciate the opportunity to lay out the strategy that I am offering to the administration. I hope that we can come back to the strategy that has been adopted by Congress over the last 10 years that would have American troops in America, that would create American jobs in military construction, that will save taxpayer dollars, and assure that when our troops go into harm's way, they will not be blocked by European countries that do not allow us to use airspace or train tracks or the ground. We cannot afford that kind of luxury in this kind of environment. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.